Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and let me have your attention, please. Thank you so much for coming out this evening. I know most of you. My name is Dr. Christopher Hammonds. I am a professor of government here at the university and director of the Morris Family Center for Law and Liberty. And our mission through the Morris Family Center is to make sure that our students understand the principles on which our nation was based and appreciate the sacrifices by the men and women who fought so dearly for those principles in the founding of our country. I want to take just a quick note to mention that as part of our mission, we are in the process of beginning a capital project to build a replica of Independence Hall on campus to be used as a classroom building to teach classes in history and government and law and free market principles. And I want to thank the gentleman who's going to make that possible because he's here tonight, although I hope I don't embarrass him. But Dr. Stuart Morris, here on the front row. One of the original founding fathers of HBU, and next month he'll be 99 years old. So we're going to celebrate his birthday next month, but he's here tonight. You can come say hello to him before you leave this evening. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Sara Frear. She will be the first of 4 lectures this year in a series entitled Women of the American Republic. Dr. Frear teaches American history and Western history here at the university. She earned her doctorate in early American history from Auburn University and is a member of the Organization of American Historians and the American Society of Church History. Her research focuses on early American women writers, and she enjoys uncovering their talents and introducing them to a wider audience. Her speech talk tonight will be entitled Mercy Otis Warren, Setting the Stage for Revolution. Dr. Frear.
Thank you. They have me wired. How's the sound? Good? Okay. In the back as well? Welcome, everyone. Thank you for turning out this evening. I'd like to thank Dr. Hammonds for arranging this lecture series. It's an honor to be giving the inaugural lecture for this year's exciting series on women of the American Republic. Also, special thanks to one of our librarians here at Moody, Kristen M. Thance, hunted down these 18th century news articles that I looked for and could not find. So without her help, is she here tonight? Well, she knows she was indispensable. Without it, this lecture would not be possible in its present form. Also, thanks to my colleague, Dr. Tony Joseph, for sharing some of his more extensive library on the colonial era and for some interesting discussions on revolutionary culture. And Nan Donahoe and the rest of the team at Innovation and Strategic Marketing, who have helped with some visuals. You'll see that the nasturtiums have a role to play in their own right. The illustration I ordered did not arrive on time, and so they prepared this for us on less than 24 hours' notice. Now, the textbook account of the road to revolution tells us that the growing tensions of the 1760s culminated in the Boston Massacre in 1770 and then quieted down for a couple of years in the early 70s. But even in those years, a contingent of Bostonians was busy fanning the flames of resistance to British policies. And surprisingly, one of the most prominent of these was a woman, Mercy Otis Warren, who was then in her early 40s. Many women of the time were intensely interested in politics, but Warren was unique in that she employed her pen in the service of what would become revolution. At a time long before it was acceptable for women to do so. And I want to draw your attention to the portrait of her done by John Singleton Copley. It's on the PowerPoint image on either screen here. It was done about 1763. At the time, she was around 35 years old. And there was an interesting modification at some point, perhaps during the years we're going to cover. Originally, she was depicted with roses. Very traditional feminine symbol for the time, and then it was replaced with nasturtiums. And this was not common in portraiture for either sex, but nasturtiums symbolized patriotism and heroism. I don't know that it was done by Copley. I don't think it is known. Looks a little bit artificial to me, perhaps not quite as well done as the original roses. Her hands seem to be in front of the nasturtiums rather than fingering them, but that's what she's That's what the intention is. And nasturtiums were a popular flower at the time in colonial salads. They had a peppery flavor, rather like Warren herself. She could be quite sharp-tongued. And so this change in flowers, I think, tells us something about Warren's own changing self-perception. Now, she's not very well known today. She was quite well known in her own day. Jefferson and Hamilton seldom agreed on much of anything, but they did agree that she was a genius. And John Adams, a close personal friend, praised her and encouraged her writing. Her most famous work was a history of the Revolution, titled History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution. It was published in 1805. However, what I would like to do tonight is examine some of her pre-revolutionary writings, published anonymously at the time, that did much to set the stage for the American Revolution itself. They were published in Boston papers from March of 1772 to January of 1775, sometimes in pamphlet form in other cities as well. And they were published as advertisements for plays, which included excerpts. These, in fact, were political commentaries. They were never intended for performance. Warren herself called them dramatic sketches. A little bit about Mercy's background before we get into her pre-revolutionary writing. She was born, according to the new style, September 25th of 1728, but I like the old style. America was switching from the Julian to the Gregorian system in the 18th century. And in the older Julian style, she was actually born on September 14th, which means that this lecture is being delivered purely by coincidence on the eve of her birthday. And she lived a very sheltered childhood in a small seacoast town in Barnstable, Massachusetts, at the western end of Cape Cod. Her father, James Otis Sr., was a prominent local lawyer, quite conservative and strict, but in one sense not conservative at all. He recognized his daughter's intellectual gifts and wanted to foster them. He arranged for her to be tutored alongside her brothers so that she received the same classical education as they, highly unusual for a girl at the time. And she was very close to her brothers, especially to her brother James Otis Jr., whom she called Jemmy. Jemmy himself was very gifted, an original thinker, a graduate of Harvard, and his early resistance to Britain, based on legal principles, has been seen as laying the groundwork for independence. He also, remarkably, believed in women's political equality, thought they should have the same political responsibilities as men. Really unheard of for the time, but perhaps he was inspired by his sister's example. Now, in 1754, Mercy married James Warren, also a Harvard grad. Probably they met through her brother. And it was a very loving marriage. They were devoted to each other. They raised 5 sons together, and Mercy was quite accepting of the traditional responsibilities of the time of wifehood and motherhood. They moved to Plymouth, but in one respect, they were not traditional at all. Both had strong principles, political principles, and interests. And James Warren, like Mercy's brother, like her father, recognized her exceptional intellectual gifts and encouraged her to be engaged in politics. So she had 3 close men in her life, all with the name of James, encouraging her to think politically and, in fact, to be active politically. The views of the Otis Warren family, they pretty much shared in common. They were highly critical of abuse of power, of abuse of authority, and they became convinced that the British administration in Boston was highly corrupt. And so their home in Plymouth became a regular meeting place for more radical Boston dissidents. Add to those political dissensions, they also experienced a strong personal resentment toward a leading figure of the Boston administration, and that is the Governor Thomas Hutchinson. James Otis Sr.'s political ambitions were thwarted twice by Hutchinson, and this is the beginning of an intense family antipathy toward him. But in 1769, that antipathy deepened because Mercy's brother was very involved in an intense quarrel with British customs officials over economic resistance to British policies. And he got into an altercation with one British commissioner whose fellow officers then joined in the fight, and his nose was pulled, and he was hit over the head with a sword, and was injured badly enough that it contributed to a mental breakdown. That is, it didn't cause it, he had shown signs of instability before, but it worsened it to the point where this very prominent character in the early revolution has to pretty much withdraw completely from the political stage. And this seems to have created a sense of political mission for Mercy. She was horrified as she watched her brother's mental health deteriorate, and she saw the loss of his reason in one who had been so gifted. And she expressed this long before she was writing her dramatic sketches. She was writing private poetry. And in a poem from 1770, she expressed her grief upon watching her brother decline. She doesn't name him in the poem. It's titled, "A Thought on the Inestimable Blessing of Reason, Occasioned by its Privation to a Friend of Very Superior Talents and Virtues." And she wrote, "What is it that moves within my soul, and as the needle from pole to pole directs me to the final cause, the central point of nature's laws? 'Tis reason, Lord, which thou hast given, a ray divine let down from heaven." And she earnestly hopes in this poem to remain mistress of her own mind, nor waste beneath the frown of age as I tread down life's narrow stage. So she felt the need to carry on for her brother, and this would lead her to write for publication as he had done. There was also her own moral passion underlying her political views. Her worldview is quite dualistic as it comes across in her writing. It's good versus evil, American resistance to British administration, or in her view, maladministration, very much a moral good cause. The British administrators very much identified with evil. And in this, she's tapping into a Puritan literary tradition. Now, she was descended on both sides from a long line of Puritans, going all the way back to the Mayflower. And they had a tradition of presenting history as a spiritual drama, despite being quite suspicious of the theater itself. This Puritan tradition in itself was rooted in an older tradition going back to the Middle Ages of medieval morality plays in which the characters are allegorical. And one character is Vice, a consciously evil and duplicitous character. And Warren is going to portray Governor Hutchinson as Vice. She also, on account of her education, received a strong base in the classics. And she shared a common assumption that the period of the Roman Republic was a period of virtue. And so she often alludes to that and to Greek mythology and Roman mythology in her writing. So altogether, she has a strong sense of theater, despite probably never having seen a play performed. Well, if you're dramatically minded, the events of Boston in the early 1770s are going to provide you with plenty of material. So let's start with the events that were swirling around the Boston Massacre of March of 1770. Thomas Hutchinson, the Otis family nemesis, was the acting governor from 1769, and there were growing tensions between British officials and troops stationed there and the Boston townspeople moving toward the massacre of March 5th. But even before then, on February 22nd, there was an act of political violence, now mostly forgotten, but at the time it scandalized and enraged Bostonians. A group of boys wanted to play their part, and they put up an effigy in front of the store of a prominent importer merchant, Theophilus Lilly, and Lilly's neighbor, Ebenezer Richardson, who was a low-level customs official and was widely believed to be an informer, picked a quarrel with the boys, tried to destroy the effigy. They fight back. He ends up, he and a neighbor who's fighting with him, taking refuge in his house. They close the door. He grabs his gun, goes upstairs to the second-story window, points his gun out the window, fires into the crowd of boys, and kills Christopher Sider, some 11 or 12 years old. And another boy is wounded. And when the people of Boston saw that, they broke into the house, disarmed him and his co-worker, almost lynched them on the spot, but were persuaded to instead take them to a magistrate. They were taken to Faneuil Hall, where they underwent an inquest in front of 1,000 citizens. And Richardson was formally charged with murder and thrown into prison. And on February 26, 4 days later, there was a public funeral for young Sider, with a procession of 500 children and 2,000 adults starting at the Liberty Tree. And then there were still more spectators joining in. The Sons of Liberty put this inscription on the tree: "Thou shalt take no satisfaction for the life of a murderer. He shall surely be put to death." This was the largest public demonstration in Boston up to this point. Now, the Boston Gazette also investigated in very modern style and reported that Richardson was a customs employee. The customs commissioners issued a statement denying this. But on March 5th, and this is the same day as the Boston Massacre would take place that evening, the Boston Gazette published both the commissioner's report and proof that Richardson was indeed a customs employee, as well as an informer. So now the commissioners had apparently been caught in a bald-faced lie. So the Sider murder is among the sharpest aggravations leading up to the Boston Massacre, and the massacre itself is a turning point. The first blood, in addition to Sider, shed by Americans in resistance to the British. Unlike the Sider killing, it's publicized quite widely across the colonies. Paul Revere's famous print of the British soldiers firing point blank into a helpless crowd made for very effective revolutionary propaganda. The historical reality was another matter, however. There were 5 killed, 6 wounded, one convoluted story. Captain Thomas Preston, the British captain in the Boston Massacre, was questioned, and he and the 8 soldiers were jailed to await trial. Now, their trial wouldn't happen till the end of the year, but in the meantime, Ebenezer Richardson went up for his trial on April 20th. And Bostonians fully expected that he would be convicted and sentenced to death. Well, he was convicted, but not sentenced. The judge suspected he would receive a royal pardon. And this turned out to be quite right. Richardson remained in jail for another 2 years and was released when the pardon came through. Now, the Boston Massacre trials came up in October for Captain Preston and December for the soldiers. And the British defendants were very ably represented by John Adams, the Otis's good friend. He brought out the uncertainty of the prosecutor's case, the fact that the soldiers had, after all, been under attack from a mob, that there was such a thing as a right to self-defense. Facts, he said, are stubborn things. The result? Captain Preston and 6 of the soldiers were acquitted, while 2 were convicted of manslaughter and branded on the thumb. And Adams' legal victory had a calming effect. And here's where the textbooks tell us that American resistance calmed down for a couple of years. But let's look more closely, because the Boston radicals were not in hiatus. They did worry that the resistance was losing steam, Americans were becoming complacent, and they took some active steps to stoke the fires. In 1770, one Isaiah Thomas founded a brand new newspaper, the Massachusetts Spy, and this paper published mostly anti-British commentary, inflammatory enough that it constantly risked being shut down. The masthead featured Franklin's motto, "Join or die," with his dismembered snake now integrated into a single serpent. And the radicals kept the memory of the Boston martyrs alive, including that of Sider. On March of 1771, they held public ceremonies commemorating their deaths, again in March of 1772. And also in March, on the 26th, on page 2 of the Massachusetts Spy, there were a number of short news items, including this very foreboding one. We are well informed that the infamous murderer Richardson resided last week at Stoneham at his sister-in-law's. It is said he intends to come and tarry in Boston very shortly. And tarry is in italics. Now on the same page 2, a curious advertisement, all in capital letters, appears. Underneath advertisement, it says, to be exhibited for the entertainment of the public at the Grand Parade in Upper Servia. The Adulateur, a dramatic performance consisting of 3 acts. As a specimen of the work, we have extracted the following passages. And it's followed by a scene from Act 1, Scene 1. This is a monologue by Rapatio, who is the Bashaw of Servia. Now, this use of Bashaw, usually it's pronounced or it's spelled Pasha with a P today, suggests an exotic or oriental authoritarianism. Rapatio is deliberately evil, and he's intent on subduing freedom-loving Servia. He begins, could I have thought my stars would be so kind as thus to bring my deep-laid schemes to bear? Though from my youth ambition's path I trod, sucked the contagion from my mother's breast, despotic rule my first, my sovereign wish. Yet, to succeed beyond my sanguine hope, to quench the generous flame, the ardent love of liberty in Servia's freeborn sons, destroy their boasted rights, and mark them slaves. However, Rapatio is troubled by his conscience. He's long suppressed it, you see, but it still confuses him on occasion. And he says, I dare not meet my naked heart alone. I'll haste for comfort to the busy scenes where fawning courtiers, creatures of my own, with adulating tongues, midst gaping crowds, shall strive to paint me fair. Rapatio needs an adulator, or in fact, many of them. The reader is then treated to a portion of the second act, this time a monologue by the courageous patriot, Cassius. And Cassius begins, "Oh, my poor country, I've waked and wept and would have fought for thee and emptied every vein when threatened ruin lowered over thy head. But now, too late I fear, the manacles prepared by Brundo's hand, cruel Rapatio with more fatal arts has riveted beyond redress. My indignation's roused, my soul disdains, nor will I longer stay where poisonous breath of sycophant's applause pollutes the air." Well, readers understood very well that this advertisement was political commentary, about 1 1/2 columns of it. Rapatio they could easily identify as the highly unpopular Governor Thomas Hutchinson. He was hated, although he was an American, he was seen as very much a tool of British oppression. Servia, of course, is America. Upper Servia, why, that must be Massachusetts or Boston. Brundo is a reference to Hutchinson's predecessor, Governor Bernard, who was seen as almost as unscrupulous as Hutchinson, but less adept. Cassius, the heroic Cassius, not so easily identified, but Warren's notes identify him as her own brother, James Otis Jr. So now the stage is set for a confrontation between an evil tyrant and his sycophants and a dauntless patriot ready to die for his country. Nearly a month later, on April 23rd, another pair of excerpts appears in the Spy. This time the scene opens in prison with a monologue by Ebenezer, described in the cast of characters as a friend to government. Ebenezer. He doesn't even get a pseudonym. He's in a state of terror Sure that he has been condemned to death for the murder of the young boy, he says, "'Tis done. Nor all their boasted power can save me, not Hazelrod himself with all his art can soothe the falling passions of my soul, or pour one ray of comfort on my mind." Enter the aforementioned Hazelrod, Lord Chief Justice. He's a stand-in for the real Chief Justice, Peter Oliver. Oliver had enraged the Boston radicals by opining that it was the unruly crowd who was to blame for Sider's death, and not Ebenezer Richardson. Hazelrod then rebukes the Ebenezer of the play for his lack of courage, but he also reassures him they have all met together and worked out a plan to crush the friends of freedom, extirpate the dear remains of virtue, and, like Nero, at one dread blow to massacre his millions. Further, Hazelrod adds that Sider's groans were music in our ears, and that they are ready to glut our vengeance. And notice, Christopher Sider doesn't get a pseudonym either. The next excerpt is Cassius, again, Mercy's brother Otis, James Otis, and this time he's in dialogue with a young patriot named Marcus. They agree that it's impossible to advance politically in such a corrupt world. However, lowliness and poverty with a clear conscience are better than fame and wealth. So these four scenes constitute the whole of Warren's The Adulateur. It's a kind of moral melodrama, isn't it? There's no subtlety in the identification of the characters as good or evil, but that suits the temper of the time. Americans in the 1770s had a consciousness of being actors in a great historical drama, and they were anxious to play their parts well. Now, The Adulateur is usually seen as a comment on the Boston Massacre, but the undisguised references to Sider's killing suggest to me that Warren herself was even more moved by this incident. After all, by now she was the mother of 5 sons, and her second son, Winslow, who was her favorite, would have been about the same age as Christopher Sider. In addition, she may have accepted her friend John Adams' argument that the British guilt in the massacre was uncertain, mitigated, whereas Sider's death was clearly first-degree murder. Warning: if you look for this play in published collections of Mercy Warren Otis's writings, you'll find a full-length play, 5 acts. This is not her work. It contains the excerpts from the Massachusetts Spy, but the rest of it was written somewhere else. And she herself called it a plagiary, complained that an unknown author had composed this play before she had the opportunity to compose another installment. So the full-length play was published as a pamphlet in New York City, was quite successful in its own right. The author never identified. But since it wasn't Warren, let's move on to her next play. The Defeat was published a little over a year later, this time in the Boston Gazette, a more established paper. And the excerpts appeared in May and July 1773. And again, it's a critique aimed at Governor Hutchinson and his officials with a similar cast of characters. The historical context, still more convoluted. It appears during a period of publicity surrounding the correspondence between Hutchinson and his Lieutenant Governor Andrew Oliver, who was also his brother-in-law and the brother to the Chief Justice Peter Oliver. These 13 private letters in which Hutchinson attributed the colonial rebellion to taxes, recommended diminishing the role of colonial assemblies, reducing the English liberties of colonists by degrees, so it truly looks like a plot, and sending more troops. These letters had been sent in confidentially to Ben Franklin, who had then passed them on to the Massachusetts Bostonian leaders with the recommendation that they be kept quiet because they were so inflammatory. Well, in the end, they were read before the Massachusetts Assembly and published in the Boston Gazette. And it created outrage, and it was seen as proof of Hutchinson's duplicity and his desire to subvert the Massachusetts Constitution. And the revelation of these letters occurred at the same time as a boiling controversy over the news that Hutchinson was being paid a royal salary rather than being paid by the Massachusetts Assembly. And all the furor over this provoked Hutchinson to call the Assembly into emergency session. In January of 1773, there was a long debate between Hutchinson and the Assembly, all of it later published in pamphlet form. And on June 2nd, the Massachusetts House created a committee to request removal of Hutchinson and Oliver. And the defeat reflects this new sense of vindication of the rivals. In the adulateur, Rapatio was triumphant while Cassius was in despair, but in this sketch, it's Rapatio coming to a bad end. And the advertisement jestingly presents this as a little entertainment in view of the dearth of theatrical performances that season. So it begins with Rapatio at first confident that his scheme is succeeding, but fearful of justice. He says, "I tremble at the purpose of my soul. The wooden latchet of my door ne'er clicks, but that I start and ask, does Brutus enter?" In the next scene at the Senate House, there's a debate between Rapatio's supporter Proteus and the critic Onestus. Proteus was Brigadier William Brattle, who could famously see both sides of the story, and this was often attributed to support for Hutchinson. Onestus was James Bowdoin, a former supporter of royal authority who changed sides after the Stamp Act. So this debate between the two ends with a patriot victory, Proteus saying, "I'll hasten hence, I see the rising storm." Onestus saying, "I detest from my soul these base designs. Go, tell thy master, he deceives no more." And in the final scene, Rapatio is lamenting the sad reverse of fortune. All his supporters have been swept away. He finds himself facing death and damnation. "I plunge, I sink, oh, save me from despair. What do I hear? Is fierce Cerberus there? The portals of the yawning pity guards where traitors doomed receive their just rewards." And in installment 2, on July 19th, whereas in May, Rapatio had been sinking into hell, he's now once again on terra firma. But he's still in a state of terror because of his evil schemes have been exposed, and there's an extended dialogue between him and Lieutenant Governor Oliver, who is the fictional Limpet, lamenting the failure of their plans. Limpet says, "Yes, all is out, but how I cannot learn, though I my timid, trembling form laid by to find the clues." They cursed the patriots who have exposed and confronted them, so that a brave and freedom-loving people now despise them. In desperation, they resolved to hire a skilled propagandist. They hope the prostituted pen of Philoletes can save them, for, as Limpet comments, the people won't be content with hanging effigies much longer. Philoletes was one of several names that Warren gave to the loyalist Jonathan Sewell, who the radicals erroneously, as it turned out, believed was the author of a series of pro-administration letters called the Massachusettensis Letters. Well, after that, Warren's pen is quiet for about a year and a half, and then in January of 1775, the group appears in both the Massachusetts Spy and the Boston Gazette. She's clearly moving up in the world. And we see at least one reader in the 18th century drawing lines in his newspaper between the characters in the play and characters in news items printed in the same issue. This time the play is clearly a farce. The Loyalists portrayed as absurd as well as sinister. And the context is that the Boston Tea Party has by now taken place in the previous month, in December. And the British administration has reacted with harsh punitive measures directed at Boston. They call them the coercive acts, but the colonists, outraged, call them the intolerable acts. Hutchinson has been removed from his position. in April 1774, and he's replaced by the British General Thomas Gage. Warren will call him Scylla. And one of the intolerable acts, the Massachusetts Government Act, has shut down the colonial government. Governor Gage replaced this now with a mandamus council to which he appointed the members. Of the 36 appointees, 25 accepted, but 9 quickly resigned under pressure. Thomas Oliver being one, a mob of armed men forced him to resign, and this left 16 counselors. This is the group that Warren is now going to satirize. He portrays them as either brutal and sinister or as clownish and cowardly dupes, and she portrays the dupes more sympathetically. After all, they've been duped, and yet by now even they have lost faith in Rapatio. Hazelrod is still present. Brigadier Hate-All, Judge Meager, this is Foster Hutchinson, Thomas's younger brother. They're among the brutal characters, among the cast of clowns, not so easily identified, but such names as Hector Mushroom and Simple Sapling Esquire, Krusty Crowbar. This gives you an idea of the characters. The clownish characters are fearful, uncertain, ready to give up. Simple Sapling says, "I know not what to think of these sad times, the people armed, and all resolved to die ere they'll submit." Krusty Crowbar returns, "I too am almost sick of the parade of honors purchased at the price of peace." And he adds that he's even lost faith in Rapatio, whom he used to trust. It's plain that he's a traitor. But Hazelrod scoffs. "Oh, what misgivings! Why these idle qualms, this shrinking backwards at the bugbear conscience? By Philoletes' arguments convinced we may live demons as we die like brutes, I give my tears and conscience to the winds." And Hate-All chimes in, "Curse on their coward fears and dastard souls, their soft compunctions and relenting qualms. Compassion shall ne'er seize my steadfast breast, though blood and carnage spread through all the land." Now, the group is summoned to council by Scylla. Scylla is actually sympathetic to the Patriots. He believes that Americans are basically loyal. They've been maddened by oppression, and he laments that King George has received bad counsel. He doesn't want to spread ruin across America. But then he exits the stage, and the group is frustrated. This balancing of passions will never do. Scylla must be persuaded to protect the buzzing reptiles that crawl around his court. And they agreed to convince him to use brutal measures. Says Judge Meager, "Let us repair and urge brave Scylla on. I long to see the sweet revenge begun. As fortune is a fickle, sportive dame, she may for us the victory proclaim." And then everyone exits, but the curtain rises on a lady. This is Warren's first female character, and she's allegorical. She represents perhaps freedom or America, and she laments the coming warfare. What painful scenes are hovering o'er the morn, when spring again invigorates the lawn, instead of gay landscapes' beauteous dyes, must the stained field salute our weeping eyes? And she concludes, warfare must continue and the dead lie unburied till British troops shall to Columbia yield and freedom's sons are masters of the field. Then o'er the purpled plain the victors tread among the slain to seek each patriot dead, an adamantine monument they rear with this inscription, "Virtue's sons lie here." And so the group veers from the ridiculous to the sublime as she prepares herself and for her readers for what she foresees will be a long and bloody war for American independence. And this is 3 months before the fighting had actually broken out at Lexington and Concord. If Thomas Paine, the author of Common Sense, was the prose writer for the American Revolution, I suggest to you that Warren was its poet. One scholar of Warren has called her its muse. With her poetic vision, she conveyed the sense that Americans were engaged in an epic moral drama. In this way, She set the stage for the American Revolution. And yet, there was always a broader scope to Warren's aspirations. During the revolution itself, she followed events avidly. As her own health declined, she continued to write poetry and plays, to look after her household in the midst of the disruptions of war. She missed her husband badly as he served the revolutionary government. Yet even during the revolution, she believed that she saw a new moral enemy, this time an internal one: the decay of American virtue. As early as 1778, before the revolution had shifted to the South, she wrote to her friend John Adams, "A state of war has ever been deemed unfavorable to virtue, but such a total change of manners in so short a period, I believe, was never known in the history of man. Rapacity and profusion, pride and servility, and almost every vice is contrasted in the same heart." She perceived this degradation to continue after the revolution was over. And so Warren had always experienced a frustration with the chaos and strife of worldly affairs after the revolution, during, and in fact even before. She engaged in politics out of a sense of duty and moral passion. Yet, although all the world might be a stage, and a crucial one, it was also a narrow one, as she observed in that poem about her brother's loss of reason. She desired, indeed, she was driven to make a difference, but she also had a yearning to flee to the peace of the countryside, to find repose in the beauty of God's creation. Even her nasturtiums, similar to these in the illustration here, nasturtiums symbolize patriotism and heroism, yes, but the flowers also have a more gentle and nurturing connotation: gardening, feeding one's family. And these nasturtiums in her picture, you see, are white and delicate pastels, not the fiery oranges and yellows that we usually associate with nasturtium. It's as if Warren's patriotism were being transfigured into something more ethereal. And her unsettlement over the events of the revolution comes through in an untitled private poem she wrote during the revolution itself. She was horrified by the violence, horrified by the violation of women. She wrote about this more frankly than male commentators. In this poem, she called the world an encumbered stage, and it begins thus: "While life's encumbered stage I tread and walk amid this busy scene, while here the immortal soul resides to animate this frail machine, let not the worthless joys of time or empty cares engross my heart, nor let a low or sordid wish ere once debase my nobler part." And the poem continues: "The all-pervading power who sees the proper place, the fittest part, for each performer on the stage, I trust will guide and guard my heart. He has preserved my early youth, upheld by his almighty hand. In midst of death's relentless power, I yet among the living stand. O universal Lord of all, me still protect, of mine dispose, as perfect wisdom judges best, till death at last the drama close. Then, on some angel agile wing, O may the immortal soul arise, and with a seraph's voice proclaim her grateful anthems to the skies." I'll be happy to entertain some questions. Yes?
In your research, did you find that Mercy Warren had a favorite classical work, perhaps a favorite dramatic classical work? And if so, can you talk maybe a little bit about how that particular work influenced either her political opinions, her writing, or her love for poetry?
I can't say I came across that, although that isn't an aspect of her history that I looked into very carefully. Was there something from the quotations that particularly struck you as alluding a particular work?
Going more for some allusions to Ovid, although I suppose John Bunyan seems to have an influence there as well.
Yeah, I don't recall coming across a mention of Ovid in particular in the scholarship on Warren, but there is a great deal of scholarship. I mean, she's been understudied, but that has been changing the past decade or so, and she's definitely getting more attention, so perhaps it will come up. Other question? Or not.
Thank you.
I'll get rid of my, thank you.
Well, thank you for coming out this evening. And before you leave, there'll be, if you haven't signed in already when you came in, there should be sign-up sheets for your classes on the way out. We have some refreshments waiting for you. And please join us next month when Dr. Donnie Wilson from the Department of English will speak about Abigail Adams, who happened to be a good friend of Mercy Otis Warren. So thank you for coming out this evening. Thank you.